Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today, I wanted to show you my sorghum adventures from 2023. Sorghum is a type of grass. There's a bunch of different kinds and a bunch of different cultivars out there. And sometimes it's grown just as a forage. In fact, it's most often probably grown just as a forage for cattle and things like that. Sometimes it's grown for its grain. And so at the top of a sorghum plant, you get all of these little seeds, and these can be ground into a flour, and it's a nice alternative, not one-to-one, but it's an alternative flour for gluten-free baking. And sometimes sorghum is crushed. The canes, so the stalks are crushed, the juice is squeezed out, and that is boiled down to make sorghum syrup. It's similar to sugarcane. Sugarcane is a grass. Sorghum is also a type of grass. So if you're thinking of playing around with sorghum syrup, you need to make sure that you get a sorghum variety that has been bred for its sugar content, because not all of them have. That's important. But it's a really neat multi-purpose plant on the homestead, because you can use it for forage, you can use it for grain, and you can use it for syrup. And so that's an awesome combination, in my opinion. The tricky part is sorghum is normally grown in the southern part of the United States because it is a very long season plant. I am in Southeast Washington, zone 7A, and we are kind of right on the edge of being able to pull it off. We have a long enough growing season, but you really need to get the timing right in terms of when you put it in the ground, because once sorghum has been frosted and the plant is not completely dead, bad things happen. You cannot feed it to livestock. There's, I think it's called prussic acid, is something that the plant produces once it's been frosted, and that turns into cyanide in the body. So you do not want to make sorghum syrup with sorghum that has experienced a frost. I'll put some additional information up on the screen about this. I was just recently reading something in a local agricultural newspaper that I get that talked about this. And evidently, if it's completely frosted back, the plant is dead, and it's been sitting for more than 7 days, a lot of that issue goes away, and so you can still use it for livestock feed at that point. But you need to make sure that your cattle or goats or sheep or whatever are not in there while it's dying back, because it will cause serious problems. So I have a video on sorghum syrup, and last year I just split the canes down the middle, put them in a big 5-gallon pot with water, and boiled them for an hour, and just let that sugar that was in those canes diffuse out into the water, and then I removed the canes and cooked that water down. So that's how I made sorghum syrup last year. That does work. It is really time consuming, and it's also very energy expensive because it takes a lot of energy to cook down all of that water. This year I decided to do something a little bit more efficient, and so I bought a cane press, and this is a manual cane press. I just bought it on Amazon, and I got this idea years ago. My husband and I took a vacation to Miami Beach, and one of the little farmers markets there was actually selling fresh pressed sugarcane syrup as a drink, as a beverage. And so he had this little machine where he could crush the sugarcane. And so I knew something like that existed in the world. If you just Google sorghum press, the stuff that comes up is very expensive. And so that was way out of my budget and not what I wanted to do. But this manual sugarcane press works perfectly on sorghum as well. And so that's the video I'm going to show you. I'll show you how that works. And then I boiled that resulting juice down and made sorghum syrup. If you can see this, I'm not sure you'll be able to, but I do have a separation happening in the syrup where at the top I've got a little bit of residue. This is totally fine to eat. There's nothing wrong with it. But even though I filtered this multiple times, including through essentially a coffee filter to get out as much possible residue as I can, there's clearly still some stuff happening here. And so I need to do some additional research on how do you prevent this. I think what you do is once you've got the syrup squeezed out of the cane, you want to let it settle, and then you pull from the bottom or the top, depending on where things are floating, so that you're leaving behind some of that residue. Again, not an issue in terms of safety, but certainly an issue in terms of of how that looks, because visually that's definitely not super appealing to have that kind of raft of a little bit more green material on the top. So we're just going to continue to play with sorghum over the years and perfect our systems. This sugarcane press that I bought is manual. It's actually surprisingly easy to use, and I was expecting to be super sore from the process of squishing all of that sorghum cane through it, and honestly I wasn't. It was fine. So it's very efficient, it's well designed, it's got a nice heavy weight to it. It also can be converted to a motor, and so I will probably look into doing that next year, because it does take a long time to hand press things. But for the price, it was definitely worth doing, and a big step up in efficiency from the way I did it last year. So sorghum syrup, let's see how that works. So the additional information I'm giving you here is from a publication that's free online from the University of Kentucky, last revised in the year 2000. I will link to that below so that you can read it. It's more for larger scale production, but some of the details about sugar content and when to harvest and how to treat the syrup are in there, and that's really helpful. I'm stripping the leaves off of my sorghum. You can press it with the leaves on, but it's going to add a lot of surface area where juice is just going to stick and not go into your bucket because it's going to stick to the leaves. And it wasn't a big volume here, so I just went ahead and stripped mine off. So here's a little bit of additional information on when to harvest your sorghum. You can tell how mature it is by how far along the grain heads are at the top. And if you can still pierce them with a fingernail and a milky fluid comes out, that's called milk stage. And then it's soft dough and hard dough stage before it's completely mature. They say that the best time to harvest is when it's between soft and hard stage. That is when the sugars are at their highest. Here's the biggest probably stalk of everything that we did. You can see this little mill is having no problem at all with that. It does tend to curl up on the end when it first comes through, and so it can get caught on that lip there. But this was the thickest of everything that we had, and turning it was a breeze, so no problem. I think sugarcane is potentially harder, and this is a sugarcane press, and so it's not having any problem with the sorghum. And you can adjust the thickness here with those knobs at the top. I just had it cranked down as tight as it would go. So you can see here that you can also put multiple stalks through this little press at one time. And so when they were really small, I just was doing a big handful, and that worked out just fine. And this is mostly what I did, was a set of 3. The press is actually a flat surface. You can see it here a little bit better, how it's just one big flat roller. And also you can see how that gets caught just a little bit at the top. And it has a screen where the juice runs down and then goes through the screen. So the really large chunks of stuff generally are getting filtered out immediately, but also your canes are coming through right over your bucket, and so sometimes stuff just falls in there. So you end up with a little bit of stuff in there regardless. The Kentucky publication suggests letting your juice settle for 3 hours or so, and then leaving behind the stuff that sinks to the bottom. I don't really have a great container to do that in, although I have done winemaking, and I imagine I could probably siphon that off and that would work. And then they suggest you skim the juice as it's heating as well. Sorry for the terrible lighting in our garage. The weather was really, really cold at this point, and so we just moved everything into the garage to process. But it really took my husband and I probably less than an hour to do all of these. And so it goes pretty quick, especially when you have a little bit of help. So here's our finished juice, and it's really interesting to taste it. It has a really fruity, grassy flavor that actually would not be bad in a mixed cocktail. And the sugar content here is actually pretty high, probably somewhere around 15%. So I wanted to taste it just to see. And it's hard to place, but there's definitely a fruity note in there that's kind of fun. You don't want to let your juice sit for very long. If you let it sit for more than 3 hours at room temperature, as it's settling, it's probably going to start to ferment a little bit. So you definitely want to let this settle and then get it on the stove. As your juice is starting to heat,
a lot of those proteins and starches are going to just float to the surface, and you can just skim those off. And so I skimmed that repeatedly. I probably cooked it down for a couple of hours in that big pot, and then this is the next morning. You can see it's been cooked down quite a bit. And I'm just continuing to skim. This is just a really fine little strainer that I bought at an Asian grocery store. Your syrup is finished when it is between 226 and 230 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I'm checking this. I've done this enough times with different syrups that I kind of get an eye for it. You definitely can notice the bubbles start getting thinner as it's getting close to when it's finished. So I'm checking. And then look how that foams up as it breaks the surface tension there. So we know we're getting close, and you really want to watch it in this last few minutes. Don't walk away or you will overcook it. So I'm looking for 226, and there we have it. Doing one final skim. There's really not much left to skim here. And then I'm pouring this into mason jars. I'm going to preheat my mason jars with a little bit of boiling water. The last thing I want after all this work is for a mason jar to crack, because I'm pouring, 220 plus degrees syrup into a room temperature jar. So I'm just preheating these just enough to where hopefully they don't crack. I also, you notice, have them in a glass dish so that if they do break, I'm going to catch that syrup and hopefully be able to save it by filtering out any glass shards, because I really don't want to lose this after all of this work. And of course, pouring off of anything, it's always going to go where you don't want it to go, but mostly it worked. And this is a 24-ounce pickled asparagus spear mason jar, and then the other one is a 32-ounce quart jar. And I was kind of guessing on how much I had here, and I came pretty close. Not quite 2 quarts. And then in order to sanitize this without water bath canning it, I'm doing what's called a hot fill and hold. And this is used commercially with jams and things. When you've got a high sugar content and a fluid that's very, very hot, you can put a lid on it and just flip it over for 3 minutes. And as long as your solution stays over 180 degrees in that 3-minute time, it's going to sanitize and any mold spores that might be in there and kill them, so that you don't actually have to water bath can. I could have just water bath canned this, but I wasn't in the mood. These white caps were a mistake. I should have gone upstairs and gotten some rings, but I was lazy and they did leak, and so I ended up having to recap it later. That's our sorghum syrup process for this year, and we're just going to keep refining the process and improving, and hopefully getting more and more volume at much less labor. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.